Ancient Gaul, a land stretching from modern France, minus its southern coast, to Belgium, southern Holland, western Germany, and most of Switzerland. Rome, as a Mediterranean power, had no obvious claim to this territory. Yet by 50 BC, just before the beginning of the Pax Romana, Julius Caesar forged this territory into a Roman province. What drove this conquest? Was it fear of barbarian hordes, the lure of wealth, or one man's audacious quest for power? Today we'll uncover Rome's tangled motives, partly through the very words of Julius Caesar, ancient coins, and details about the political situation in the Roman Empire just before the beginning of the Pax Romana. And in doing so, I hope we'll answer the question, which is the subject of today's episode: why did Rome decide to conquer Gaul? Let's find out on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Questions and Answers, Episode 2. Why did Rome conquer Gaul? Before we get too far into today's episode, I want to map the terrain, both the actual terrain, but also the historical map. When Julius Caesar stepped into Gaul in 58 BC, he described it as a land split in three ways: the Belgae in the northeast, the Aquitani in the southwest, and the Celts, or the Gauls as the Roman called them, in the heartland. That's how Caesar opens up his own account of the Gallic War. So while in shorthand we might say that Gaul was essentially modern France without the city-states along the southern coast, really this territory stretched into modern Belgium, the southern part of the Netherlands, and western Germany up to the Rhine River and most of Switzerland. This was a vast, rugged patchwork of land. It was part of the broader barbarian world, as the Romans would have thought of it. Celts and other tribes people, many of them nomadic, stretched all the way from the island of Great Britain to the Eurasian steppe. Rome's history with Gaul was fraught long before Julius Caesar first set foot in that province. In 390 BC or thereabouts, Gallic warriors stormed down from the north and they sacked Republican Rome. And this was a trauma that would be etched into Roman memory even centuries later. So even though by Julius Caesar's day, that ancient invasion was more mythology than history, and the Gallic parts of northern Italy, which were known as Cisalpine Gaul, were already thoroughly Roman, the Romans still had a lingering fear of the peoples that lived beyond the Alps in what was called Transalpine Gaul. Officially, Rome claimed this territory as a province. They sent a governor there. They traded with cities like Massalia along the coast, which is where modern Marseille is to this day, a city founded by Greeks around 600 BC or so. Yet at the same time, there was trouble. By the late 2nd century BC, Germanic tribes, these are people like the Cimbri and the Teutoni, swept through this part of the world, striking fear into the Italians until one of the great leaders of the Republic, Gaius Marius, crushed those tribes by the end of the 2nd century. The Romans clearly thought of Gaul as a place that needed to be civilized and maybe could be civilized, but it did not appear that they had any kind of grand plan for what to do with Gaul. It was both a frontier, but also at the same time an aspirational province. And that's where Julius Caesar comes in. Caesar certainly recognized that Rome needed to secure its northern frontier. Sack, way back in the 390s, was not just a myth or a scary bedtime story to tell Roman children at night, but it was a warning. And so by Caesar's time, Romans kept in their minds that sack way back in the 390s. They remembered the Cimbri and the Teutones. Other tribes in Caesar's day, like the Suebi, right on the edge of Transalpine Gaul, were perceived as looming threats that could invade Italy at any time. And Caesar was ambitious to deliver Rome from this threat and win the glory as a result. In Caesar's Gallic War, he claims that many of these peoples, especially the Belgae and the Celts to the north, were volatile, impulsive, and prone to rebellion. To Caesar, Gaul was a land of fickle loyalties, ripe for chaos, a tinderbox that desperately needed Roman oversight. But a general fear of the various tribes up north doesn't tell the whole story. Gaul was also a wealthy part of the world. The city-states in the south of Gaul were trading hubs for goods arriving from much further north. Tin from Great Britain, amber from Northern Europe, hides, even hunting dogs. Strabo, the Roman geographer, mentions these goods and more. So controlling Gaul would allow easier access to the riches of Northern Europe. Also in Gaul was plenty of gold. The Roman Quintus Servilius Caepo seized a trove of Gallic gold from a native sanctuary in the 120s BC, and stories that there was plenty more gold up in Gaul circulated among the Romans for decades afterwards. So by the time Caesar launched his campaign into Gaul, there was every expectation that the plunder he would obtain from that province would be astronomical. Lastly, there were, of course, the people. The Romans were ever more desirous of slaves, and slaves were obtained through captives in war. So Gaul wasn't just a frontier to be frightened of, it was also a treasure chest to be looted. But there was one more reason the Romans, and Caesar in particular, decided to invade Gaul and make it a Roman province. Julius Caesar had been consul in Rome in 60 BC. To obtain that office, he went into astronomical debt, and then to carry out the duties of his office, he used violence and intimidation, breaking numerous constitutional norms in the process. So by 59 BC, the next year, Julius Caesar had political enemies in Rome, as well as plenty of creditors eager to get their money back. He was drowning in debt and political heat, and Caesar needed a lifeline. That's why Caesar pressed to obtain the governorship of Cisalpine Gaul. So before Caesar could be prosecuted by his political enemies or taken to court by his creditors, he took an army across the Italian border into the Gallic provinces. Almost as soon as Caesar arrived in his province, challenges began to crop up. One of the Gallic tribes, the Helvetii, pressed by Germanic peoples near Lake Geneva, sought permission to traverse Transalpine Gaul, but Caesar refused to allow it, concerned with the fact that this tribe had once had alliances with some of the Cimbri, that group that had invaded Italy about 50 years prior. The Helvetii, however, refused to heed Caesar's warning. They decided to cross Roman territory anyway, and so Caesar confronted them in arms with approximately 12,000 Roman legionaries. The number of Helvetii, at least as Caesar describes it, outnumbered him 4-1. Caesar's soldiers, however, won that fight, and the surviving Helvetii were forced to return back to their territory under the oversight of some of Caesar's officers. There were also challenges that arose from one Celtic tribe disliking another Celtic tribe. So later that same year in 58 BC, one of the Germanic leaders named Ariovistus, who Julius Caesar himself had called a friend of the Roman people, demanded territory from another tribe called the Aedui, also Rome's allies. This squabble between two of Rome's supposed friends forced Caesar to pick a side. Perhaps because the Aedui had 15,000 warriors nearby, Caesar decided to go with them, marching his soldiers up to take on Ariovistus, who ended up fleeing across the Rhine River. A couple of years later, in 55 and 54 BC, Julius Caesar not only made it all the way to the edge of Gaul and the English Channel, but actually crossed over to the island of Great Britain. And if you'd like to know more about that part of the conflict, you can check out episode 14 called British Invasion. I just note here that Caesar didn't necessarily conquer Great Britain, not at all really, but reaching that part of the world and winning some battles definitely boosted Caesar's prestige in Rome. After returning to Gaul and continuing to subdue various smaller tribes across the region, the decisive moment in Caesar's Gallic War came in 52 BC against Vercingetorix, a Gallic leader who rallied numerous tribes against Rome. Near the end of summer in 52 BC, at a location in the center of Gaul called Alesia, most of Caesar's army of 50,000 Roman troops took on an equally massive Gallic coalition led by Vercingetorix, and they had the superior position. They had a fortified spot on a hilltop with wooden walls that could be defended easily. Caesar responded with an extraordinary feat of engineering, constructing 2 concentric fortified lines, about 15 miles total, of walls, ditches, and towers that encircled the entire hill, keeping the Celts besieged while using the other wall that he built to defend himself against a much larger force, about 250,000 Gallic warriors who sought to aid Vercingetorix's beleaguered forces atop the hill. Over the course of weeks, the various armies skirmished with each other until the Gauls launched a desperate assault in early October of that same year. Vercingetorix's troops launched down the hill, attacking one side of Caesar's wall, while the Gallic force outside of the wall also pressed in an effort to squeeze Caesar, destroy his army, and stop the Roman occupation of Gaul. Caesar was able to repel this attack by keeping his legions disciplined, while also leading cavalry charges outside of the wall, and after a day of intense fighting, Caesar had killed enough of the Gallic troops on both sides such that Vercingetorix realized he was not going to escape, and so the Gallic king went before Caesar, took the knee, and the last major resistance to Roman rule in Gaul was over. So now you know a little bit about why Rome decided to conquer Gaul, and you also know how they did it. And if anything, you know it wasn't so much Rome's decision as it was Caesar's. And I suppose that brings up another thing that's worth talking about, and that is the extent to which this was Caesar's war. The Senate didn't even give Julius Caesar that province originally. He was supposed to care for the roads and highways of Italy. This was meant to be a degrading position for Caesar, and he had to bypass the Senate, asking for a vote of the people to be given the Gallic provinces that enabled him to launch this war. So in many ways, the Roman authorities didn't want this war, or at least didn't want Caesar leading it. But once Caesar became governor, he had what was called imperium, that is, the power to command Roman armies. And once governors like Caesar took this command power outside of Italy, they were very much autocrats, acting with almost no senatorial oversight. Normally, governorships were only supposed to last a year or so. Caesar, through negotiating with powerful allies in Rome, namely Pompey Magnus and Crassus, who was very, very wealthy, was able to secure or buy enough support to win control of his Gallic provinces for 2 5-year terms, a total of 10 years, enabling him to conquer the entire province. And Caesar used the wealth that he obtained in Gaul and the immense celebrity he achieved by such a major conquest to launch his civil war on Rome itself, becoming eventually dictator for life and setting into motion the events that take place just prior to episode 1 of this podcast. So the conquest of Gaul was crucial for Julius Caesar's own personal ambitions, but it also bore consequences for the Roman Empire, and these extended beyond mere territorial gain. The conquest of Gaul fundamentally altered Rome's trajectory. After the Romans took Gaul, their influence permeated. Latin became the progenitor of modern French. Roman legal principles took root. Gallic cities sprung up. Roman infrastructure like baths, libraries, and aqueducts were built in numerous Gallic cities, shaping the contours of Western Europe in ways that are still visible to this day. Gaul was one of the last provinces of the Western Roman Empire, and it was, in many respects, thoroughly transformed by centuries of Roman rule. So if we think about the reasons that Gaul was conquered in the first place, in most cases, they proved to be accurate. By securing Gaul and making it a province, the Romans created a more stable northern frontier, one that lasted until the middle of the 2nd century. Hundreds of thousands of slaves, vast wealth, also poured into Rome and into the coffers of its elites, especially Julius Caesar, following that war. And then, of course, we see Caesar's own political ambitions realized as a result of his Gallic War. The Romans conquered Gaul out of a combination of circumstances and will. And in doing so, they strengthened their empire and fundamentally changed the history of Western Europe forever.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.